Hi, I'm Paul Guppy. I am Vice President for the Washington Policy Center, and this is our regular weekly update about what's going on in Olympia during the legislative session, the issues that we are covering, and of course, the major legislation that may, if it's signed by the governor, affect the lives of everybody in our state. So as an independent free market think tank, we are constantly trying to push uh, policymakers to get good information, good research, all to the purpose of creating good governance, good policy that makes Washington State a great place to live, work, raise a family, run a business. That is sometimes difficult because Washington is now becoming known nationwide for high taxes, heavy regulation, 1.5 steps behind California when it comes to oppressive, expensive government. That has not yet started to drive down the population in our state, although it is in California. Many people know, many of you know, I'm sure, that California lost population last year for the first time in its history. Washington State is still gaining population modestly, but the census shows that we are also moving towards flattening. The reason I bring that up is because in the next apportionment, California expects to lose 2 congressional seats. Washington State will probably stay flat where we are with 10 seats, although our prediction is that if the policy environment continues to move in a negative direction, that Washington State will begin to see a loss of a congressional seat or declining population or a restriction on our economy. We are not at that stage yet, but I'm projecting ahead about where we see current trends. Specifically, what's going on in Olympia is they are a little more than halfway through the current 60-day session. The cutoff date for legislation to be reported out of committee has passed. Last time I went through a list of bills as to what survived and what died. And the next step is in a week or so is the cutoff date for bills to be enacted by either the House or the Senate. Each bill would have to pass in its House of origin and then be sent over to the other House. That's the next stage. And so rather than run through a laundry list of bills that we've been tracking, I think this time I will focus on 1 or 2 key legislation that is coming up, and then towards the end of my presentation, give a couple of victories that we see and that are moving in a positive direction. But I can tell you the number one bill, what one Republican lawmaker described as the worst bill this session, is SB 5770. What that, I've described it before, but what that bill would do is reverse a policy that the voters of our state put in place in 2001, which capped the amount of increase in the regular property tax in each jurisdiction around the state at 1%. This sounds like it's an oppressive limit because it's less than inflation, but the reason that it has worked so well for 22 years is the 1% limit on property tax collections only applies to one kind of property tax, and that is the regular property tax. There's new construction, there's other kinds of property tax that permitting and things like that expand the base for jurisdictions. And also, as you know, the property tax is only one form of revenue for government. So what matters is looking at the overall revenue that people in public office have at their command. And the answer is they have plenty. The state government is running about a $3 billion surplus, but county and city governments have also almost doubled in their revenue in the last 10 years. And I could give you lots of math, lots of fiscal numbers, but the bottom line conclusion from any reasonable person is local and state government in Washington has literally plenty of money. I mean, they are swimming in money. What they do is they spend it as fast as it comes in and then go to the public and say, oh my goodness, we have a deficit, we have a shortfall. When you hear terms like that, it always means, I mean, I've been doing this for years. I've never run into a case where a unit of government had a genuine reduction in dollars. What happens is the rate of increase slows. So they're expecting 6% increase, they only get 4%, they call that a 2% cut. Anybody who works in public finance knows that that's the case. And that is undercutting the justification for this bill. As you would expect, it is being pushed by the Association of Cities, it's being pushed by county officials going to their Democrat allies in the legislature and saying, remove this cap, give us more authority to increase the regular property tax burden by 300% every year. They want to go from 1% to a 3% cap. And that bill was just barely eked its way out of the Ways and Means Committee this last week. It is now in the Rules Committee. It's on second reading, it's called, which means that it is primed to be put on the calendar for floor action in the Senate, possibly as soon as this coming week. On the policy itself, the reason that this is such a big hit to taxpayers would be, if it's enacted, is we all know the power of compounding. So a 1% increase every year is quite a bit. A 3% increase is even more massive than that. So the fiscal note on this bill put out by Office of Financial Management shows that if SB 5770 passed and the governor signed it before July 1st of this year, in the current budget cycle alone, the state would get an additional $191 million. That's in 23-25. We're already halfway through the 2-year budget cycle. And even in the remaining year or so in the current budget, it would be nearly $200 million in additional revenue going to the government. And the hit over 12 years is $6 billion, which is a massive number. And you might wonder, how can they possibly get to that? And the answer is compounding. So, and then the other effect of a cap, we know from the policy world, and many people who deal with limitations in fiscal policy know that if you put a cap on, the people who are supposed to be controlled by that spending limit treat it as a floor. So before the 1% limit was in place, the limit before that was 6%. And places like Seattle and King County and jurisdictions across the state would regularly announce, we, quote, took the 6%. That is, the next budget includes a 6% increase in property tax collections. Today, they quote, take the 1%, because that's what they're allowed. If they were allowed 3%, you could be sure that they would go right up to the cap. And that's one reason this bill is causing so much concern. So it was considered in the Senate Ways and Means Committee a few weeks ago. On January 18th, there was a public hearing. Because of the online capability we have now, a policy, by the way, that Washington Policy Center had been arguing for years, long before COVID. We had said people should be able to testify online. The Senate has that now, in addition in the House. And what is the result? For this January 18th hearing, nearly 9,000 people signed up to testify on this bill. 90% of them, 92%, signed up to testify against it. So that is a huge number. That is 10 times the number of people who respond to an average opinion poll, let's say. And these people made it very clear that they are no on this bill. And yet the Democrats passed it out of committee anyway. Our own Mark Harmsworth has written both a blog and done media and done a bill analysis about this and sent it to all members of the legislature and to the general public. It's available on our website, his legislative memo about SB 5770. And Mark also signed up to testify. He was Johnny on the spot, like we always are. He jumped in to sign up right away. He still ended up being 68th on the list and was not called upon to testify. But our position is really well known. And so the other point about the tax increase in this bill is that it's a regressive tax. This property tax hits across everybody, across the board. I've had arguments with people on the left that renters don't pay the property tax. And I'm like, you know, what economics classes did you take? Okay. Property taxes are built into the cost of housing of any kind. Renters pay the property tax through their rent. They have to. The property owner has no other way of paying the tax. So I've had that argument with people. But it's undeniable that this is as a flat tax, it has a regressive effect, which is lower income people have a harder time paying this tax than upper income people. We have heard from compassionate people on the left who have said they want to help the poor, they want to help working families. But when it comes to getting revenue for the government, suddenly that reasoning disappears. The Democrats, both the chairman of the committee and the sponsors of this bill have said absolutely zero about what the financial hit would be to people living across our state, what it would do to the cost of housing, so undermines affordable housing. And the only thing we can conclude from that is that this is driven by greed of people in government. So little philosophical point here is, again, we debate with people on the other side all the time about free market principles and capitalism and how that economic system works. We think it's the most productive system for creating opportunity and prosperity that human beings have ever found. But the other side says that it's based on capitalist greed. You're trying to be greedy. Okay, a bill like this comes along, providing $6 billion of money that the government doesn't need. And our thought is, well, I think that there's nothing about human nature that gets shut off when you suddenly find yourself in government. People in government are as greedy as anybody else. And this bill indicates that. My own term for that is socialist greed, that no one is immune from wanting more money. And if lawmakers feel like they have the power to pass this bill, they're going to do everything they can to get it through. Now, there is a positive note in that the public pushback is huge on this. An accusation that is being made by some of the Republican leaders is very simple democracy, saying to the majority, you're not listening to people. I mean, when nearly over 8,000 people sign up on a bill to say no on a policy that was enacted by the voters in the first place. Another part of this story is when the 1% property tax limit was first enacted, it was sued in court by activist groups. And, what I consider to be our corrupt Supreme Court overturned it immediately. Said, well, we don't care what the voters say. We've decided on technical grounds that this initiative is overturned. That turned out to be so unpopular that Democrats and Republicans got together and passed it as a state law, and Governor Gary Locke signed it. So at one time, this policy had broad, popular, bipartisan support. That bipartisan part is gone. The Democrats are no longer listening to people on this issue about the burden of property taxes. So that, in our view, is the best chance for stopping this bill, is that continued messages to the legislature, continued media coverage, analysis like we are putting out that shows what the real world impact is. And the last sort of opinion I'll give about this bill is there is a case of going to the well too often. So sure, people in government want more money, but we have the Jay Inslee carbon tax is hitting people hard. There is already a popular initiative signed by over 450,000 people that want to repeal that carbon energy gas tax. And the legislature has to deal with that now. It may be going to the ballot in November. I think there are some savvy Democrats who would realize that piling on in a hot election year like we have now is not a good idea. And to us, that is the best hope that this bill will die this session. We'll continue to track it and see what happens there. Next issue I'll touch on quickly is HB 2331, very controversial bill, which would give the superintendent of public instruction the power to cut funding for any school district that the superintendent determines is not implementing controversial CRT or DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, critical race theory. Our entire country is debating these ideas about introducing racist-based policies in the public schools, and how controversial that is. This bill would give the superintendent, we see two problems with this bill. The obvious one is coercing or bullying local school districts about materials they have in the library. What is curriculum in the classroom? We think those are local decisions, and it's important for local school districts to be responsive to the community regarding what they teach kids, especially on things that are controversial like this. The second thing is what is always number one for Washington Policy Center, and that is democracy and the governance issue. So who the heck is the superintendent of public instruction, a state official, to be given the power to decide whether he approves or disapproves of some curriculum that's in a local school district? There are nearly 2,000 public schools in the state. And so we think that that's an interference in local government. And the last problem with this bill that I'll mention is it, again, piles on. It's like the tax issue I mentioned. It's just another hit to the public education system that's controversial, unpopular, and leads families one after another to get to that natural tipping point, which is, hey, I'm pulling my kids out of the public school. We've had enough. Already, and again, human nature would say, if a situation becomes too difficult, a question pops into people's heads, which are in all parts of life, which is, what are my alternatives? What else can I do? The default assumption was, hey, my local public school is the best way for my kids to get an education. It's community-based, it's down the street. I know the people who work there. That is becoming alienated from the average parent, the average family. Already 46,000 families have left public education for a variety of reasons. We think that trend will continue, and that the solution to that is to provide more alternatives in public education, more choices, but primarily for local officials to listen to what parents have to say, listen to their concerns. So those are two major bills that are running through. They passed in committee, they're still alive. They're controversial, as I said. Washington Policy Center will continue to be engaged and provide information and inform the public as to what they're about. But I thought I'd also touch on three policy victories that have occurred this session. And it's nice to see some things moving in the positive direction. One is SB 5815, and this is a bill which would allow licensed physician assistants from other states to accept jobs in Washington state. This bill's on the nurse licensing bill that was already passed and signed by Governor Inslee. This just expands the pool of talent that we can have working in our own hospitals and clinics. One subset of this bill is often when military families move to Washington state, a spouse may have a license, physician's assistant, a license, and yet can't work in this state because the license comes from another state. This bill would rectify that. The positive thing is it passed the Senate on January 24th. It passed the Senate by 49-0. So there are some ideas out there that have broad support that where members can come together in a bipartisan way. And now it's in the House Education and Workforce Committee. If it passes there in the House, we would join 15 other states that are looking at this same idea. So that would create a pretty big group. The next one I'll mention is Senate Joint Resolution 8207. This would have cut the voter threshold for passing a school bond from 60% to 50%. This is a taxpayer protection model. The reason that the percentage threshold is higher for adopting a school bond is because this is taking on mortgage debt for up to 30 years. That's the reason that our state constitution requires a 60% approval for a school district to take on more debt. That bill to lower that standard failed, so we still have the taxpayer safeguard in place. We think that's important for two reasons. First, we always go by empirical. This policy has been in place for many decades. It is working, it's popular, why change it? The second thing is, if a community takes on 30 years of debt, that means that the students who are in the school who are supposed to benefit from this spending are going to end up paying for it in their working lives. So a school bond is simply putting debt on a future generation. And that's why we think the 60% safeguard is important there. And it looks like that policy is going to be retained. And the last is a SB 5956, which would increase per student funding available through local levies. This is another tax limitation safeguard that this bill is trying to get rid of, which would allow local school districts to impose even a larger per student tax on their communities. It's a property tax, in addition to what the state is already charging people. That bill failed. We had argued against it, but we also think that this represents what we call the spillover effect, where Washington Policy Center is providing education and perspective about what the tax burden is like, and then an individual tax increase bill dies in committee. We think that's because of the broader analysis that we're able to provide. So that's the update of what's going on this week. Last Thursday, we had a great YP Young Professional Social event at Flat Stick Pub in Redmond. It was a lot of fun. The next event we have coming up is on Tuesday, February 13th, our online on-the-go event hosted by David Bose. And then upcoming in March is our popular Evening in the Desert event for some of our top supporters and for people who spend the winter in that area. We have a speaker coming in, and that will be in Palm Springs. And again, very popular. It always sells out. And I want to give you an update about that. So that's it for now, and I will be back in the future with more news. Thanks.